struck yesterday was the International Day of Peace, which I thought was quite an appropriate kind of moment for us to reflect on our own relationship with nature, with the planet, with each other. And there's still so much work to be done. I was, yesterday afternoon, had the kind of honor of moderating a discussion amongst heads of state and the UN Secretary General on next steps on the climate crisis at the UN. And I was struck at just still how fragile the trust is between countries and how much more work needs to be done. We had the Prime Minister of Pakistan. We had videos of what's happening in Pakistan today. And we had the G7 countries and their inability to step up and recognize that we are part of the problem. And so just this is a theme that obviously we are all grappling with for a very long time, but just something that I think incredibly important. Today, we're going to focus a little bit more about the role Indigenous leadership plays in addressing climate change and protecting global biodiversity. We're going to focus a bit more on Canada and Canada's boreal forest. You all know it's the largest, most carbon-rich primary forest on the earth. I was really struck, twice as much carbon as the world's oil reserves, incredibly important. But not just in terms of carbon. I mean, it provides an incredibly important, the land, the place, the sacred place for communities that live in and around that area. And as we think about that, I was also struck that the Convention on Biological Diversity, as you all know, will be taking place in a couple of months in Quebec. And so having this story is particularly timely and appropriate. We're going to focus, a little bit more about, recognizing the threats to these areas, and in particular, industrial logging, the demand for forest products. What are some of the drivers that are creating the pressures on these lands? And what are some of the efforts that are trying to protect, defend, and respond to that? And in that context, the Cree Nation, whose traditional territory, as you can see there, encompasses an area nearly 3 times the size of New York State, we're going to really focus on that story. And that's one of the things I like particularly about today is we're not going to have 5 speakers in 20 minutes. We're really going to have a couple of speakers. We're going to tell a story. We're going to talk, get more in depth with two really wonderful guests that we have today. So I want to first start by introducing Grand Chief Mandy Gull-Masty. She's a member of the Cree First Nation of Waswanipi, the second woman elected Deputy Grand Chief and the first woman to be elected Grand Chief in the Cree Nation of Ichi in Quebec. Ichi is composed of 10 Cree communities spread out over an area of 2/3 the size of France. Again, that picture there. She's been a pioneer of community-based conservation planning. She was elected in July 2021 as part of the Indigenous delegation from Canada that went to secure an apology from the Pope for the treatment of Indigenous peoples by the Catholic Church. So that must have been quite a story. Delighted to have you. And we also have Kate Ogden. Kate is the Advocacy and Movement Building Manager at 7th Generation, a leading tissue and other consumer products companies. I was struck by the title. Only if more companies had movement building managers, I think the world would be a better place, right? Prior to that, she spent 12 years at Greenpeace, implemented a number of really important campaigns. And she's going to be providing a little bit of a perspective on how the marketplace can support Indigenous rights, Indigenous-led conservation efforts. Kate, great to have you with us as well. And great to have all of you here today and all of you virtually. So I want to start a little bit, Mandy, with yourself and your story. And just to start, tell us a little bit about yourself, why you chose to seek public office fairly early, a bit about your homelands and the meaning behind the Cree name, kind of Ishi.
Bom he yumianeng ginu yemen nishtem ego he ewina naskum goga when jiji duxundo na shewina ewi gwet shemian jina naskumoik eji optmik mina jishga de jimigwik nashke we webgo ji de lanape iuts kasngasdo a daikoten how utashimo. So what I said for those of you who are not fluent in Cree is good morning. I always speak my Indigenous language first because I am a proud carrier of it. And I am thankful to see everybody participating today. And of course, we give thanks for this day that we were given. And as well, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the territories of the Lenape peoples. These are their unceded territories. And as a guest and visitor here, I'm thankful that they allowed for us to be present in this space. So good morning, everybody. Thank you. I want to say that, yes, I am an elected official from my nation. We are a very young nation. It's not because we haven't been in existence for a long time. It's because we have a population that is incredibly young. So we're about 20,000 members. And those members, 60% of them are under the age of 18. So this is a huge challenge for leadership in terms of planning, where we want to go in the future. For myself, I had always worked in administration, very behind the scenes. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I was approached by my community members. They wanted me to seek office, to work for them. And it was a challenge. I did not think that that would be a pathway for my career, to be very honest. I thought it was, not something that I foresaw in my future. So 7 years into the future, to be the leader of my nation, I think is still at times surreal, but challenging, very interesting, huge learning opportunity, and of course a lot of responsibility. That's probably my biggest takeaway. And I'm really pleased to be here participating, to be able to share the story of our nation. We are a nation that is very, very closely tied to our traditional territories. We still have members who hunt, fish, and trap. We also are very closely linked to our provincial government. We do have a nation-to-nation agreement with them. It is a unique agreement. I do not think will ever be replicated in Canada again, but it has really put us in a position where we have a lot of responsibility and authority over our territory. And we also have mechanisms that recognize us in the participation of activities in the territory. And it varies. It varies from us having cultural practices as well as being part of different projects and planning in the territory. We are also a nation that is highly impacted. I think a lot of people may be familiar with almost 50 years ago, Quebec declared that there would be hydroelectric development in the province. This was our traditional territory. We were heavily impacted by it. We are also heavily impacted by forestry, by mining activities, and this is why the critical work that we do in protected areas and conservation is really for us a foundational file to ensure that the Cree way of life is continuously practiced, not only in traditional traplines, but also in set-aside spaces that we can use to have our youth be present on the territory, but also share and teach others coming to our territory to learn about you.
Did not realize that the nation was so young, both demographically and otherwise. But on the last point you made, I would love to hear a little bit more about EU Pimatsiwin, but you'll correct my pronunciation. But this point about the Cree's relationship with the land and water, kind of the Cree's way of life. Could you say a few more words about that?
Your Cree is actually quite good. So Iup Matsuin is Cree way of life. And for Iuj, I think one of the things that I'm most proud of is that we do still have a very deep connection to our territory. And Cree way of life means that you are connected to your traditional territory. So we have a trapline system in our territory where the land is was distributed to family groups that are from each community. This is not the traditional Cree system. We had a traditional Cree system where people shared their trap lines. We were very nomadic, going from one place to another. But we do now use this trapline system. Each family has the responsibility to be a steward to their trapline system, and this is a big part of the Cree way of life. Understanding and protecting the balance between your role as a steward, your traditional trapline territory, the wildlife, the fauna, the flora even, and being able to share that with the youth and young children of your family. That knowledge transition between generations, that's a big part of keeping Iub alive. So being able to hunt, being able to fish, being able to consume traditional foods, that's a big part of keeping yourself alive, but also, you know, having cultural knowledge, having cultural skill. These are things that I think my youth are very proud of. Every winter, we run programs that teach youth how to make traditional snowshoes, how to prepare to harvest animals, how to prepare the hides, how to make use of them, how to sew, how to make, you know, moccasins. So for us, culture, I think, is really defines what sustainability is. Going out, you know, killing a moose, harvesting it, it's food, you're using every part of it, you're using the hide, you're making clothing out of it. Like, this is something that we continue to practice to this very day. And I'm really proud of that. I am really proud of that.
And just maybe a little bit more on your home community. You're from Waswanipi, I believe, and you know, where is it on the map, and a little bit more about what it felt like growing up there.
Okay, so I'm from an extremely small community. At the time that I was born, I think we had 1,200 members. Now we're almost at 2,000, but I kind of felt that growing up in this community and also living with my mother, we lived in Ottawa because she was going to university at the time when I was very young, seeing both sides of the Cree world and the non-Cree world really made me understand the value in being Indigenous and the close connection to my grandmother, to my family. I think the communities are very unique in the Cree territory. There are 9 right now in total. We have one that's in the process of being built, and we have another 11th community that we've recognized outside of the boundaries of Quebec. That's just on the other side of Ontario. And I think that that's something that we really have to acknowledge, is that provincial boundaries do not dictate the territory of Indigenous peoples. We were here long before those boundary lines were drawn. So the fact that we have members in and out of the territory is a challenge, because our Quebec government sometimes does not fully understand why these members live elsewhere, but we recognize their rights and their identity as Indigenous peoples.
One of the other big issues at the moment is the broadback. Could you say a few more words about what the broadback is and why it's so special?
The broadback forest is an old-growth boreal forest, and it is in the northern section of my community's territory. So every community has a trapline system. In my community, we have 63 traplines. Prior to 2000, we had not had any recognition for mechanisms to deal with forestry. So there was a lot of activity, industry coming in, clear cutting, really not respectful or even understanding any of the Cree way of life, the activities of our hunters and land users. And we have been challenged with trying to protect this old growth forest for a number of years. And I was really proud that we were able to secure protection for the northern part of the broadback forest, and you'll see it in this system. The green areas are protection areas that we had identified previously, and not just a few years ago, we added everything in red. So we have over 39,000 square kilometers of protected areas, conserved areas, areas with vast biodiversity in them. Unfortunately, though, I think there is more work that needs to be done. There is the southern part of the boreal, the broadback, which is still additional boreal forest that needs to be protected because of what is there. And this is really the habitat of the woodland caribou. This is an essential species for the Cree Nation. This is also an essential species for the forest. But we continue to work on trying to secure that additional protection. This has been a long-standing file with our nation. We continue to engage. Of course, we're now going into an election period, so we're waiting to see who the next government will be. And we intend to continuously pursue this file to secure that extra protection that is greatly needed in our territory.
So let's kind of pivot a little bit now to this point about where the threats are to the broadback, some of the efforts around protection. Maybe just to take a step and help us understand what's driving the pressure to the broadback specifically and to the boreal more broadly.
So I guess I have to answer that, I have to put in context Quebec's relationship with natural resource extraction. We are a province that is very industry friendly, very motivated towards the needs of the industry. We are mainly, I think, in our territory, really focused on forestry and mining. And one of the issues is as industry seeks new spaces to harvest, they continue to go north. And the broadback is in that northern area of our territory. One of the challenges is when industry is so friendly to government, the needs of the peoples who reside in that region are not always heard. Fortunately, I think that the Cree Nation has been very, very forward-thinking in the way that we pursue a relationship with the government. We right now, as of 2007, signed an agreement that allowed for us to be part of the consultation process. And this has been a stepping stone for us as the industry comes in to voice our concerns and to not only voice them, but identify core protected areas, core areas of culture that our tallymen and land users request to set aside. So they are allowed to protect up to 1% of their territory for zero logging, and then another 25% set aside as special sites of interest. Of course, we want to do more. It is necessary to do more. As we see the industry transition, as we see the need for additional resource on their part to continue to expedite, and we see less resource available in our territory, I think the pressure is compounding and is having an effect on the Cree Nation. So for myself, as I see, this evolution of the industry, we're really pressing hard against those pressures. We also know that once forestry comes in, mining follows soon afterwards. And it has like a cascading effect on the Cree Nation because increased forestry roads, and our territory has a system of over 20,000 kilometers of forestry roads spaghettiing throughout the southern portion of it. It has created not only access for more humans to come in and create a footprint, but it also increases the predation in the territory. And this means more large predators like wolves and bears coming in, creating risk for caribou, coming after caribou during their calving season, really having an impact on those herd numbers. And this is another file that we're working with Quebec to identify what the Cree Nation's plan is for caribou conservation. And I'm excited to hear that, right now the federal government in Canada is pursuing the provinces to come up with a strong plan. And I believe that Indigenous knowledge is a key component for that. So all of these things, the industry, the provincial positions, the type of planning, it really needs to have the input of Indigenous groups. Not only because we are residents of those territory, because we are knowledge carriers of these intricate systems through hundreds of thousands of years of having a relationship with that territory. And I think that for me, I value traditional knowledge on par with Western science. I believe for the success of the protection of these areas and the wildlife species that reside in them, you have to incorporate those two elements. Absolutely necessary.
So maybe to go a little bit, so we have the industry, and would love to just understand, are the pressures increasing or are they stable? You got the provincial government in Quebec, they've done some good things. Are they moving in the right direction or not? You got the federal government, and then of course you got the Cree Nation and kind of their response. And I'm just wondering if you could pick up on each of these and just say a couple more words about how you see
where we are today and what you see as kind of the opportunities or challenges in the future with industry, with the provincial government, the federal government, and then kind of the response.
For Cree Nation, I think we are taking a unique approach to that. So in terms of industry, we have a small region, many players, many companies coming to the table, a lot of pressure on a resource that I feel is dwindling and at risk. In terms of the Quebec government, I understand that as a provincial government, they have a position, they have, something that they want to respond to, but they also have the obligation to respond to the needs of the Indigenous peoples that live in that territory. And, you're elected at a provincial or federal level. You do not only represent taxpayers, you do not only represent people of your riding, you also represent the interests of those Indigenous groups that live in that territory. And I think that this is where we are continuously building that relationship. In terms of challenges or pressures from the industry, I see now, after almost 25 years of kind of fighting against the government, an openness on their part to work with Indigenous groups. And I think that's the key. When industry comes to work with Indigenous people and have the Indigenous voice and understanding of what it is they're seeking to achieve, then you can truly change the policy position of the government. So in the past, I would say 3 years, we've had a lot of, I believe, success in understanding what it is that the forestry industry wants to do, trying to also teach the balance with the Cree way of life and who we are. And I think that this is kind of perking up Quebec and asking themselves, okay, where is this going? So finding alliances, finding partnerships, I think that that's really one of the keys that we're embarking on to change, to change the mindset of provincial government. So in addition, I really think that for us, we are in a critical stage, a critical phase where we want to reinforce our needs, not only for the Indigenous peoples, not only for who we are as Cree Nation, but because our needs also contribute to a greater space, and that's fighting climate change. We do have a forest that is a huge carbon sink. We believe that protecting it is not only in our best interest, but we see it as a contribution to the global process in a fight against climate. So I think that Quebec is, trying to advance in this space. I encourage them to try harder because it is a lot of work. But I really believe that if you want to be successful in coming up with a policy in any area, in the fight against climate and industrial development, having that component of understanding Indigenous knowledge is critical because it allows you to base it on information and understanding of those frontline people who live in the territory and can report those changes directly back to you.
So that's quite quite fascinating, and a lot of questions. Maybe just with the industry side. So if I hear you correctly, there's now at least receptivity with some folks in industry about how to find a way to both support, align, co-create kind of how to do this with Indigenous groups. And now there's the provincial government that is willing to is looking at that, seeing how that's going to unfold and how to create policy to support that. Mm-hmm. Is for industry, is that I mean, we have seventh generation, we probably have some responsible players, and is industry broadly moving towards responsible, or is it mixed?
I guess I would have to say it's mixed. There are some groups that are very open. There are some that are like, no, we're not mentally there yet to want to pursue that. One of the things that Cree Nation has decided to do this year was those communities in the southern part of our territory that are impacted by forestry signed an MOU to come together to take up space in the forestry industry and establish what we believe are new Indigenous-driven criteria for sustainability that are in balance with the Cree way of life. I think this is a really hard concept to understand. It may sound kind of weird, fighting forestry by becoming part of forestry, but we've had 25 years of fighting against forestry, understanding what it is they do and how we can have an impact on that, I think is a new mechanism that's on the table. So I'm curious to see, will that change those people who are not there yet? We'll wait and see.
And turning to the provincial government for a moment, so what are the 2 or 3 things specifically we need the provincial government to do?
My dream list? My dream list, I would have to say Quebec, first and foremost, really has to take a firm position on enacting measures for the fight against climate change. I think that's absolutely necessary. The footprint that they have, they really need to mitigate it. They really need to start bringing it down. Investing into green energy, really ensuring that Indigenous peoples are part of that process. I see a shift, this is not just part of my dream list, but I do see a shift from industry in Quebec. I feel like a lot of eyes on Quebec as a source for energy. This is challenging for me. I do, want to see us transition away from fossil fuels, but knowing that the demand is going to increase for green energy and my territory is the energy source is really hard to come to terms with. So I want Quebec to take a position on ensuring that energy use is more efficient and that they're also aware of the impact that's going to cause on the Cree territory. So this is kind of like, this scenario that's hard to face, but important.
Just to clarify, so the point being that as the shift moves from fossil, more reliance on hydro and the impact of hydro. And so we tend to, in the climate world, get off of fossils, do clean, and yet clean can have impacts, particularly large-scale hydro.
Yes, it can. I think hydro, too, is very open and receptive to other alternative energy projects. And this is one of the things that my dream is to ensure that Indigenous peoples participate in that space for creating energy. And the fact that they're open, I think, is something that's kind of new. And I think we've already seen success in New Brunswick with large-scale wind projects in Indigenous communities, and I think that that's going to really be a catalyst for change. They're an example that it is possible.
It reminds me of Maurice Strong. I don't know if that, right? Remember Hydro-Quebec and the run-up to the Earth Summit in 1992, and just how we need to keep on pushing ourselves to ask these questions about what really is. And even when we think about solar, we think about wind, we think about hydro, there are real impacts associated with that we need to also pay attention to. 2 more questions, if I may, and then I want to bring Kate into the conversation. One is the federal good, bad. What's your take on that?
Interesting question, good or bad. I think they kind of, depends on the day, I guess is my first answer. I see a lot of good. I see a minister who has a very unique background for the role that he's in, coming from Greenpeace, very motivated, understands the problems, I think has a good idea of what the solutions can be. Bad, I don't want to say bad, but I want to say challenged in really understanding the connection. One of the things that I feel is sometimes policy comes in and you're given the solution. You're not always part of the process in determining what is best. And for me, that's where the bad falls. I always preach the position that if you do not understand those groups that you're trying to work with or support, by going there, being with them, giving them the responsibility and authority to be part of the process, you will not succeed in the policy that you've established. So I hope to see not only the Environment Minister, but the other ministers continue on this process. I think we have a really exciting relationship with the federal government, because I see for this new minister who's come in, Minister Miller, the Indigenous minister, he is very active and engaged and seeking that relationship. And I think that's going to set a new tone. So I think, still on a learning curve, but heading in the right direction.
And if we had to think a little bit about the next year or two on your dream list of concrete things the federal government could do, what would be, are there one or two things that are at the top of your list?
At the top of my list, definitely coming through with, concrete criteria for more protection. I think conservation, those conservation numbers that they've put up are good. They could be better. Recognizing that key peoples continue to play a role in that. Of course, everything surrounding climate is on that list as well. I think that legislating so that climate measures are put in place at all levels of provincial, municipal, and even at the personal level where you have to participate in this. And I think, of course, most importantly is really finally, after I think 12 years, coming through with a position on protection of the caribou. And that is because those areas that we recognize in the broadback, the Boreal, a critical habitat for caribou, need to be protected, not only at the provincial level, but at the federal level as well.
And maybe just one more, just a few more words about caribou. Just coming back a little bit to the story, why is caribou so important to the Cree Nation, and what additional reflections on that, and then I have one final question.
Sure. Traditionally in our history, there were two main food sources for the Cree, which is the caribou and the geese. I think also the caribou is really a marker for the health of the forest. If you do not have a healthy herd, it's going to tell you about the state of your forest. And one of the things about caribou is they are a cyclical species. If you disturb their habitat, they primarily eat lichen. Lichen does not grow back in 1 year. It takes a period of anywhere from 5 to 7 years for lichen to grow back. You have to be really conscientious that they are the marker for a system, a web in the forest. Once you touch one part of that web, it's going to have a ripple effect through all of the territory. So for me, ensuring that we have a healthy herd, it's a marker for health in the Cree Nation.
Clearly a lot to discuss. So we're gonna keep this crisp. A couple of more questions, and I'm gonna turn a little bit to seventh generation and get some perspectives there, and then we're gonna open this up because I know there's a lot of questions you all have.
So, Mandy, climate efforts that you and the Cree Nation are taking forward, what are you doing?
So for Cree Nation, one of our biggest contributions is our protected area. It is a conservation network throughout our territory that really is, I believe, going to be a huge contribution to the fight against climate. Other measures that we have in place right now in our territory, we're running a project where we are in partnership with the government hosting weather stations to monitor the weather levels throughout USG. This information is critical for us to understand how climate is changing in the territory. We actually also hosted our first climate event where we invited our communities to come in to talk about climate, looking at different criteria. So of course, biodiversity, but also change in culture, change in species, change in how these species are evolving, a number of climate related issues, different areas that we feel the impact. We had youth also be involved. The youth put together a video and a report where they talked about the community-based planning approach to climate and how we can fight against climate. I was really happy that our youth were able to participate in that. We now have a climate coordinator who's joining me here today, who's been really pivotal in opening this file up within our government, within our territory. And the next measures for us as a government is to really inflect internally, what is our carbon footprint? What are we going to do? What kind of measures are we going to have in place? And I think seeking more information on how we can become greener. We are a very large government. We have over 400 staff. USG is large. To get from one point across requires a lot of travel. And I think learning how we can offset that impact that we have, to me, is important. And being here at Climate Week, I think so far in the few panels that I've been to, has really been eye-opening to see what is coming in the future. And I'm also really interested in this new space around climate finance, carbon credits. I'm looking to see biodiversity credits. I'm looking to see water protection credits. I would like to set a new standard that is led by Indigenous peoples in this space. This is something that I did not hear when I went to any of the panels when talking about climate finance. Everybody's talking about biodiversity hotspots and how critical they are, how valuable they are. But these spaces did not just, come to be. They were actually managed by Indigenous peoples based on our relationship with the territory. So if you want to invest in climate finance, ensure that this commodity that you want to hold is managed. And that management is by people who live in the territory. I think that will increase the value of your asset. So this is what I'm looking to see in the future.
On that last point, I remember a few years ago, I was part of a study that looked at how well biodiversity was protected in both protected areas and Indigenous reserves and just otherwise. And what we found was that Indigenous reserves was by far the most effective approach to protecting biodiversity and storing carbon. So absolutely underscore the point about finance and thinking about what needs to happen to do that even more effectively. Last question.
Sorry.
No, yeah, I want to. So there's a lot of NGOs, here, NRDC, others. What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? What do you need more from us?
That is a great question. I think I will first speak to what you're doing well. This Protected Areas Network would not be possible without the support and work of our NGOs. We've had a long-standing working relationship, myself with NRDC, with Canopy, with Ducks Unlimited. We would not be able to identify and work with the provincial government in managing the information and doing calculations and doing the very technical work to identify a protected area, critical. I think the fact that they come in, they do it, they respect the space, that they want to learn, that they work with you, that they hold you up to be able to tell your story in a way that is, received by different areas of the world, I think is really important. Being able to talk to the government, being able to talk to people that are interested in climate and environment, being able to talk to the market. All of these things have been tools for us and I think has contributed to our success. They did not only help us in understanding the information needed to design this protected area, they also helped us get that story out there and I think put a lot of pressure on the government as well to accept these things. What they are not doing well, I cannot speak to because I've only had a positive experience with our partners.
We're going to probe further in the Q&A. Kate, let me...
Thank you.
Thank you for being patient, but so much that I think we all wanted to hear and learn. Seventh generation. Company I purchased from. A little bit about the company's approach to sustainability, and then maybe if you can, as you talk a little bit more broadly, bring it into this conversation about seventh generation's role in the broadback, in the Boreal, in Canada.
Sure, yeah. It's easy to be patient. This is, we sell the products that you need to do your chores. So it's not, I'm going to do my best to make it interesting and exciting. But this isn't just my emotional support notebook. I'm also having a chance to hear from Mandy is a treat for me, as well as for all of you. So, but I'm excited to chat a bit about it. Yeah, so as I said, seventh generation, we're a cleaning products company. But we are one that has a long history of advocacy and activism. So really from the time the company was founded. And when we think about, at the highest level, the values that we hold as a company, they are around sustainability, health, and equity. And so when we think about our sustainable sourcing policy, that's sort of our shorthand for it, but it's not just about sustainability. I'd say we actually ask quite a bit of our sourcing policy. So there's really 5 things that we have to hold in balance, which are, what's the impact on the environment? what's the impact on health? What's the impact on social issues? Do the products work well? And how much are they going to cost? And so we have to hold these 5 things in tension with one another to be successful as a company and be able to bring to market products that are able to hold on to those values and those aspirations, but are as accessible as possible. And thinking across all of these 5 areas. And so that covers a broad range, and we think not only about the impact that we have as a company, but also the influence that we're able to drive as a company and as a leader in sustainable business. When it comes to specifically the way that we think about our paper products, this is a place that we have a few different sort of tiers of how we think about it. So the first thing I can say is that 100% of the fibers that are in our paper products are recycled content, post-consumer recycled or post-industrial. 90% of the fibers that are in our packaging are post-consumer content. So our number one priority is we want to reduce demand for virgin fiber. That's number one. Where we are sourcing virgin fiber, our next priority is we want to make sure that it's certified. If there is a place that we're not able to achieve that, then our third priority there is on traceability. So where is this fiber coming from? What country, what region? Is it verifiably not from high conservation value forests? Obviously, we want to focus on that top. Like, that's where we want to be, is at that top tier of reducing demand entirely for virgin fiber. I think that we are in a position of leading on recycled content in our fiber products, but clearly there's work to be done. There's ways for us to improve. And I think listening to this conversation today and thinking about how that applies to the way that we approach sustainability as we think through the lens of our climate impact and the lens of our advocacy, we don't just think about what are we trying to do, but what's the process and how are we trying to get there? Who are we in relationship with in that work? And so I think really excited to be part of this conversation and thinking about how so many of the lessons that we've sort of applied to the way we approach our advocacy work, to these aspects on the influence side, where are there ways that we can be in right relationship, applying a better understanding of the how are we achieving our sustainability goals through things like our fiber sourcing policy. But yeah, I think that's sort of at a high level, some of the tensions that we're holding in balance when we think about the way that we approach it.
So I'm going completely off script, so just,
Right.
but recycling, certification, traceability, and really trying to push to the top. Anthony wrote a piece with the team on issue with tissue, and I'm not sure. I don't recall you gave 7th generation, but that's good.
But not an A plus.
No,
there's room for improvement.
But I believe Procter and Gamble did not get an A. So, how do we get? I wanted to ask, how do we get the industry to where you are? And let's be, it's one thing to do it for, let's say, 5% of the market. Sure. How do you take the entire market there?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of, when I think about our theory of change as a company, and you mentioned in your bio, I was at Greenpeace for 12 years before I came to 7th generation. So for me, working for a cleaning products company that has a theory of change is a pretty exciting and unexpected, honestly, career development move. But when I think about our theory of change, number one is we have to reduce the direct impact that our products have across all these areas I've just mentioned, right? So people, planet, the social issues, all of these different aspects. So that's number one, is you sort of have to do the work yourself before I think you have any sort of standing to approach the other two pillars, which I think one are how do you shift your industry? And then two, how do you engage in systems change? So how are you engaging in systemic policy change? And sometimes I think that's also in culture or narrative change. So those are sort of the three pillars that I hold on this. In terms of shifting industry, I think there's one piece which is be a proof point. So show that it can be done. You know, people will buy 100% post-consumer recycled toilet paper. It can be made, it can be marketed, people will use it. I think showing the way and constantly raising the bar for what is possible and what leadership needs to look like in these spaces is a big part of it. And then there are a lot of places when, as I talked about at the beginning, the team that I sit in within Seventh Generation, which is called our corporate consciousness team, is really two sides. It's impact, which is our sustainability folks, and it's also influence. And so that also carries into the industry associations that we sit in. We are not passive members of industry associations. We're thinking, how are we working within this association to shift their points of view? What are the issues that they're advocating on, and how are we driving that point of view and directing that? And then, of course, there's also a great way to shift industry is to regulate industry and to have better policy. And so how are we impacting policy change through the influence that we have as a business? So I think all three of those things are ways that we have to be putting those pieces into place to shift the entire industry, because we are small. I think that on our own, it's a tall order for Seventh Generation to be, punching up to a company much, much bigger than we are, but there are other ways that we can engage and influence and shift beyond market share.
So I'm going to ask you two more quick questions, but then we're going to open this up, so we'll just give you a little bit of a heads up. Looking forward to the questions in the room and virtually. So ask you the same question I asked Mandy. Government, what do you think government needs to do? And then the more NGOs. You've seen it on both sides. That actually would be a pretty interesting perspective about, do you feel kind of the international, domestic NGOs are playing the role they should be playing? Are there things that we aren't doing that we should or we should be doing differently?
Yeah.
So maybe government, and then we can...
Yeah, I think, so I'll say first that our advocacy work that I lead at 7th Gen is really focused in the US. So I'll say, my point of view is really focused there. Clearly, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. And what the part of how I think about it and the role, I guess what I'm actually going to answer that through how I have this strategy that we have set, or the task we have set out for ourselves at 7th Generation in terms of advocacy. Because what I would say now is that we know in the United States about 70% of voters are very concerned about the climate crisis, and they want to see action on the climate crisis. I would say that 70%, a lot of those folks, I would say, are probably in what we would consider our kind of core 7th Gen consumer audience. That's not to say that they're all using 7th Gen products, but they're the type of people who might. These are folks that we can talk to. When I look at what is actually happening at the federal level, in particular, around climate, clearly there is not strong enough political will. The political cost of continued inaction on the climate crisis at the scale that we need it is not high enough. There is not yet strong enough political and public will to raise the cost of inaction to the level that it needs to be. So what I see for a company like 7th Generation and what we are trying to do is, we have this platform where we talk to a lot of those folks, the folks who are concerned about the climate crisis. They're probably not doing very much about it right now. We have an opportunity to talk to those folks, to try to give them a more intersectional and nuanced understanding of the climate crisis. Our advocacy model is entirely partner-led, so when I say a more nuanced approach, it's not just this is what 7th Generation thinks about the climate crisis, but let us elevate the stories and the points of view and the asks of our partners, our advocacy partners in the climate justice movement, so that folks are coming with us on a journey of political education to have a more nuanced understanding of the climate crisis, and then giving them opportunities to take action, and then greater and bigger action over time. we are alone, clearly not as a small, cleaning products company, going to entirely shift the political and public will that is needed. But if more companies were doing that work, I think it would have a massive impact. So the government is falling down on the job, and they are not yet experiencing the consequences politically that they need to experience, and I think 7th Gen has a role to play in that. I would say on the NGO side, like, that is, we do not sort of unilaterally decide what stances we're going to take, what policy we're going to support. We work very, very closely in partnership with our advocacy partners because they know the solutions that they need for their communities. And so the work that we do and the way that we craft our policy agenda is in partnership. And I think what the NGO community needs primarily, I think, is to, first of all, be following the leadership of folks around the front lines of the climate crisis, thinking about how are we flowing resources and support and enabling that work. And I would say continuing to hold corporations responsible. I mean, I think coming from Greenpeace, my entire, so much of my own education and advocacy was through a lens of corporate campaigning, which is tremendously useful in my current role. And I think it is, I think that there is not enough accountability on either side of that equation, I think on the policy side or on the corporate side. And so I think the role that NGOs can play in that is incredibly important.
And I think both of those points really, really important. The role that companies like yours can play to actually engage and animate customers to get more politically engaged and understand the cost of inaction, huge. And this point about accountability, I mean, here we are at Climate Week. For many of us, this isn't our first Climate Week, and nor is it the only time when commitments are made. But how many commitments have, if half of the commitments made were actually fulfilled, we wouldn't be here today, right? So this point about accountability, and I'm getting a little tired, quite frankly, of new commitments. I want to see some promises actually kept. So a very good point. Look, let's open this up. You guys have been really patient, but we have two fantastic speakers, as you've seen today. Let's take some questions from here, and you're going to help me take questions also virtually. But why don't we start with those here? And just maybe, do we need to give them a mic so that those on the video? So, okay. Okay, we'll split one. Yeah, we'll share. So just to, and why don't we go to the lady over there, and just maybe say your name and maybe where you're from and your question.
Hi, my name's Max Bonata. I'm from The Guardian. I'm sure that's working. I wanted to ask Mandy, you were saying how important it is for Indigenous people to have a voice in the process. Will the Cree Nation have a voice at COP15 in Montreal? And what are you hoping to come out of those crucial biodiversity talks?
Thank you for the question. We are going to be present at COP15. I just came out of a session last week. We were speaking to the provincial Department for Environment, so we are going to be participating. In what capacity, we haven't quite identified yet, but we will be present. We are hoping to share this project as an example for what you can succeed when you work with Indigenous people, how you can succeed in that process. In addition, what I'm looking for from those biodiversity talks is really identifying a mechanism to have the Indigenous voice at that table as a permanent member, because I think that that's something, for me, that's kind of lacking, not only to have the Indigenous voice as a full-fledged member at the table to speak, to their truths, to their understanding with the environment, but recognizing that what they're bringing to the table has weight and has sustenance, as potential solutions for the talks around. I think that's really important.
The mic is working okay? Yeah. Let's go there, and we'll take a couple questions, please.
Hi, my name is Paige. I'm in New York City. I know that there's been some murmurs in the U.S. of returning some of the national parks to the indigenous populations. Has there been any kind of conversation around that in Canada? And because a lot of like the forest management, they've seen that it's better when it's returned to the indigenous people. So I just wanted to know if the conversation was going on there too.
In Canada, we've actually had a lot of successes with some really good examples. So in Haida Gwaii, in the northern part of just on the border of Alaska and their territory, they've been running a park. Even in the north of Quebec with the Inuit in the Nunavik area, they've been running a park. They have a lot of success with it. I think one of the things that I have seen from the federal government just in the past few years is really a desire to establish parks in partnership with Indigenous peoples, but also very open to the management process. And this is something that we at Cree Nation are looking to achieve with this protected area. These protected areas are not just set aside areas that we expect nobody to touch. They are living spaces that we want our members and visitors to come in and learn about Cree way of life, our relationship with our territory, but we also want to manage that. I think that's key to really having a successful program is not only engagement, it's partnership and having that level of trust to know that we have the capacity to manage a national park. So there are examples throughout Canada. One of the new ones that we are working on is actually a National Marine Conservation Area for the waters that are just adjacent to our territory. I think this will be another unique project for the Cree Nation, but I think we're starting off on the right foot with having partnership as the basis for those discussions.
Fascinating. So a national marine park. Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Okay. I was just yesterday doing a Blue Leaders event about trying to get fully and highly protected marine parks 30% by 2030. So connecting the two conversations. Let me turn to Kate, a question for you. So one of the things you mentioned, why do you think companies are not using recycled fibers? Is it the impact on financial margins?
That's a great question. I think there's probably a few things. I think always there's a concern that consumers are not interested in, or they sort of see those as a less desirable product, which again, I certainly don't think is the case. I think 7th Gen, among others, has shown that that's not the case. And I do think that it is, it requires a bit more work on the sourcing side. So, I think it's probably a factor of all of those, and I couldn't say that with certainty, but I would guess, yeah, probably. I'm sure that there also is an impact of it, that just, folks want to be able to make things inexpensively, and sell them inexpensively. And I think, as I said, it's, when I say we ask a lot of our sourcing policy, it's not an easy thing to balance all of these different demands. And so you either have a commitment, you either hold those values and are committed to them, and so you figure it out, or you have a different set of values that's sort of driving your sourcing decisions.
And just one unsolicited response from me is, although there may or may not be an impact financially, we know that what people pay does not reflect the economic costs or benefits of what that nature provides. So have we taken into account those costs, it would be a very different calculus. For Mandy, so maybe a good segue, what role should buyers of boreal forest products play in advancing the Cree Nation's conservation agenda?
I think if you are a buyer of any products, you should be asking the question, where are you sourcing from? And 2 years ago, Two years ago, I really had the unique experience to learn about who is sourcing forest products. And I was very shocked to learn about viscose and who is sourcing viscose, how essential it is for the clothing market. And I also learned through my partnership with NRDC about the impact of purchasing toilet paper on Boreal as well. So I think if you're a consumer, ask where their sourcing is. If they do not have it readily available on their website, then maybe consider purchasing products from companies that do advocate for that. I think that's really important. And I was really pleased yesterday. We had the opportunity to actually have a meeting about 7th Gen and kind of ask those kind of questions. And she was really open and responsive and very transparent in saying, we want to know our supply chain. We want to know where we're sourcing from. We want to seek that partnership. And that's what I'm looking for. So if you are a buyer and you want to ensure that you're not having an impact, on the planet, look into the companies that you're purchasing from. And that's your biggest power as a consumer, is to place your money where you think you will minimize your impact on the environment, minimize your impact on the spaces that Indigenous people inhabit, but also contribute, to measures that we need. And I think that this company, 7th Gen, is a perfect example of where I like to put my dollars into contributing to that process as well.
Let's come back to the room to see if another round of questions, perhaps. Yes.
I'll just make one comment from NRDC, but I've been working on these issues with Mandy and more recently with Kate for many years, and Anthony and our partners, Canopy, who are here. To just tie this more closely to the Boreal, Procter & Gamble gets 1/3 of its supply. It's the largest pulp buyer from Canada. 1/3 of its supply for its Charmin, Bounty, and Puffs from the Boreal. And this is a forest that yesterday we heard on a panel that was named, what was the name of it? Nature Positive Supply Chains. And I thought maybe that's a bit of an oxymoron right now. But we do need to get to that place. And they're having a huge impact on the Boreal forest, which we absolutely need, because we heard from another panelist yesterday on that supply chain panel about how we cannot cut any more primary forests. We cannot afford to do that if we're going to combat this climate crisis. So it is really, it's not a theoretical thing that we are destroying the Boreal for throwaway. We're flushing the forest down the toilet. And so I just wanted to make sure that everybody in the audience understands how closely linked our habits are to what's happening in the Boreal. So I'll go back to you.
Any reflections from either of you on Lisa's question?
The thought that I had in sort of what you're sharing and thinking about the conversation that we were able to have yesterday is just a related thought on how can a company like 7th Generation think about shifting the industry, thinking about obviously other players. And I think part of that too is also thinking, what is in your scope, or what do you take responsibility for as a company? And so not only is it sort of your direct impact, but 7th Gen's quite small. So we use third-party manufacturers for our products, and we engage upstream along our supply chain on a bunch of different areas, whether that is trying to understand how are we shifting more of our suppliers to clean and renewable energy is one piece of it. And so thinking more closely about, how are we working with the folks that are inhabiting the land, as you were saying yesterday, to verify that this certification, or what we're telling you as your supplier, is being independently verified by the folks who are living and managing this forest firsthand. And so it really, I think there's a lot that we're doing very well at 7th Generation and thinking about how are we engaging and influencing upstream in our supply chain. And this has really, I think, sort of opened a door and a new way of thinking about not only that supply chain engagement, but what are sort of the lateral points of influence and relationships to build along that. So there's a lot there. And yeah, I think there's something there to be created and then replicated and shared.
Just one very, very brief thought on that is, we have struggled to find, identify, secure adequate financing for biodiversity or conservation efforts for decades. In no small part because people don't see why protecting something far away affects them, right? So we have that fundamental problem. And I think what Mandy mentioned earlier is that there may be an opportunity, and part of that reason is because of, quite frankly, the same colonial kind of attitudes, that if I create an impact on someone else that I can see, that's fine. But climate now, and recognizing the role that these ecosystems may play in helping stabilize the climate, might create an opportunity, because changing the climate affects everyone, for potential money. And if that money can be used as ways to address that, the incentives, financial and economic incentives that Kate was talking about, that may then lead people to recycle versus virgin forest, we can begin to build, or at least take steps toward that nature-positive climate future. So this is an incredibly important moment here about whether or not climate creates an opportunity to help change the economics in ways that could lead to a better nature-positive future. So a question from, and this is a really, it's deceptively complex. What's your perspective on the role that tree planting should play relative to forest conservation efforts? So right now, as you've seen, many, many years, million trees, billion trees, trillion trees, how many initiatives have emerged around, and there's a real value in forest restoration. But help understand kind of the, how does one think about forest restoration? How should one think about forest conservation and the synergies or tensions between the two?
I guess to answer that question, you really have to ask who's planting the tree, right? Like, what's their motivation? If it's forestry industry coming in to plant, a monocrop for regeneration and harvesting, maybe not the best type of tree planting. But I think if you want to ensure that your tree planting efforts hit the targets that you ultimately wish for them to achieve, it's really learning about a mixed forest and mixed tree planting, and ensuring that before you even need to cut trees, that you ensure that you are doing everything in your capacity to not cut trees so that you have to tree plant. But if you do have to tree plant, really align it with the natural growth pattern of the forest. And of course, it's not just a scientific approach, it's also a part of a network. The species that come in that depend on that forest, I think that's something that you have to be hyper aware of. One of the examples, and I just want to give it really quickly, is in our territory, we do have industry planting a monoculture. It is having an impact on the wildlife. Our elders, our members say, traditional foods taste different. They're not eating the same thing. They're not growing in the same way. The cycles are changing around their lifespans. So I think that you may think the forest will grow back. No matter how many trees you plant, no matter how many different types of trees you plant, it will not be the authentic true forest. So you really have to do your work to ensure that you're getting as close to that target as possible, and understanding you're not just planting a tree for the sake of planting a tree, you're actually having an impact on the forest and the diversity of that forest and the wildlife that inhabits it.
What does Kate have? Because seventh generation, the industry, do they do tree planting? How does that figure?
Yeah, when I think about tree planting, what I think a lot about is how many net zero commitments made by corporations rely on planting trees to offset emissions, such that there's literally there are not enough acres on this planet on which to plant all of the trees that corporations have promised to plant in order to offset all of their emissions. So, I think that part of what we are trying to do, particularly around our climate work, is there is some great work that is being done right now to add rigor to net zero, to add rigor to how we account for scope 3. This is very, very important work that needs to happen. Within all of that, we work to be incredibly rigorous and radically transparent about the impact that we are having and what parts of the business are driving that impact, and working directly to, from an emissions standpoint, we are working as hard as we can to directly reduce the emissions that we are driving rather than offsetting them through something like tree planting. So I think there are places where from, an ecological perspective, I think it plays a role, but, where I sit, where my mind goes to that is thinking about the role of tree planting and having a splashy net zero commitment that you can talk about at Climate Week.
Just three really good points. Mandy's point that oftentimes tree planting restoration will not restore a forest to its original kind of primary state, and so the importance of conserving existing forest. I would make a point that in many places around the world in degraded areas, restoration can, when done right, help support local livelihoods, build resilience, and also sequester carbon. But also Kate's very important point, we want to be very careful about connections of tree planting to net zero commitments and make sure the integrity, both on the supply and the demand side, is real as those things unfold. We're going to take one last question. You're going to be the last question, so a lot of pressure is that okay? Any more? Okay. Oh, okay. Well, we have a few more. So the pressure is taken off. So I'm going to do a round of questions. Maybe I'll do 2 or 3 just because we're running a little bit short on time, and then we'll bring them back here. So let's do a round of questions, and then Anthony.
Perfect. It's hard not to ask a follow-up on the tree planting question, but I actually wanted to say that, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, on Indigenous Rights, puts free and prior informed consent as sort of the floor for Indigenous rights. And, NRDC put out a study a year ago, I believe, of pulp suppliers in Canada and found none of them require FPIC. In their supply areas. And so I'm curious whether, particularly for Mandy, what your thoughts are about how to ensure that free and prior informed consent is given, and who should be the one dictating whether an Indigenous community is supportive of plans on its territories.
That's okay. Okay, thank you, Anthony. I saw 2 more hands. Why don't we take those, and then we'll come back for a final set of responses. Please.
Thank you. My name's Thomas Peterson. I'm based here in New York, and I had a question for Kate. Thinking in the frame of corporate accountability and the importance of it on these issues, and understanding that Seventh Generation as a company has a sustainability mandate, but is also part of a larger consumer goods organization, Unilever. How do you think about your role as a subsidiary in pushing the corporate parent towards greater sustainability across its operations?
Great question. I think, was there one more hand, I thought? Yes.
Some corporates have this idea that decarbonization and conservation finance are kind of mutually exclusive, so I'd be interested to hear your rebuttal to that idea.
And just decarbonization and conservation finance are mutually exclusive.
That that they're not doing both of those at the same time, while in reality we should be using all the tools available to us.
Okay, great. Okay, Kate, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I think that part of how we think about our relationship with our parent company, and frankly, I think part of how they envision their relationship with Seventh Generation is that they welcome our push. So I think that I think a big part of the reason why they were interested in bringing Seventh Generation into the Unilever family is because they wanted to have a company that was pretty far out front in this work. And they have been very open to the different ways that we have pushed them on different aspects. The flip side of that is that we have, when I think about, again, impact and influence, the influence that we have the ability to drive in relationship with our parent company is much, much greater. And so in something like how are we engaging our third-party suppliers, if seventh generation represents, 2 or 3% of their business, but Unilever represents a much greater percentage, by advocating internally, by aligning Unilever with whether that is a sourcing standard or whatever the case might be, it gives us much greater influence to be able to shift industry change in particular. Do we always see eye to eye on everything? No, we don't. That being said, I think that it's a great ongoing dialogue, and I see a lot of opportunities over the next several years where we will be working within the broader Unilever framework to align on those pieces and for us to really benefit in the goals that we have and the aspirations that we hold from the size and scale that Unilever has. Thanks for the question.
I think for me right now, when I reflect on climate and where we are at, we're sadly in this frame where you're trying to incentivize climate. I believe that we're on the cusp of being pushed into a place where it will have to be mandatory. And I say that because, when you see companies like 7Gen that are, intentionally choosing to go down this path, they're also incurring costs. There's a pressure on them to lead the way to make that change. I think that we should and need to absolutely have to transition to a pay-to-play that has to be very vigorous, has to be very regimented. And I think that's what's going to push reducing carbon. We're no longer in a space where we can say, hey, let's try to have measures. I think if we want to really meet the needs of future generations, we have to say measures will be met for the future generations. And that can be, in different capacities where if you take carbon out of the ground, I truly believe you should have to pay to put it back in a very real and, high impact way. I don't understand why the fossil industry is allowed to have so much impact, yet contributes nothing to the mitigation process. That to me just doesn't make sense. So I think we're on the cusp of changing. In terms of Anthony's question, I think sometimes industry is worried. I don't know what to do. I don't have a solution. I'm kind of frozen in fear when it comes to, FPIC and consent. You have to realize that Indigenous groups are not there to play a veto card in killing a project. We're actually there to protect our rights, protect our territory, protect our livelihood. And I see Indigenous peoples as an integral part of the landscape. We have a relationship with having an influence on biodiversity. Protecting us and protecting our rights also protects the environment. It is a part of the contributions towards the fight against climate. So, in terms of the question with corporate accountability, we have to transition to a system where it is mandatory to deal with this carbon issue. I cannot say that with, bearing the weight of knowing that our generation is here looking for solutions, and the next generation to come will have no choice but to implement them. So we really need to connect those two things to be more aligned with ensuring whatever is implemented in the future actually succeeds in fighting this very real problem. And as Indigenous people, we are the canary in the coal mine. We are saying that there is something wrong. We cannot stop stressing how rapidly these changes are being felt in the front lines. Maybe you don't see it if you're here in New York, you've not a lot of green space, but take it from those people that live in the forests and understand how quickly this is evolving, because it's not just us surviving as a nation, it's actually humanity surviving on this planet, which I think is pretty serious.
That was brilliant. And we did have a effort to try to make the climate regime mandatory. That didn't work, largely because of the United States.
moved to a voluntary framework, but now starting to see some movement, but not nearly at the speed and scale we need. So how do we begin to ratchet that up? So really good point. We have one final question from me to each of you. Before we close, if you had to distill kind of a single message you want to share with the group that could fit in a tweet, which we will tweet out later, no pressure. What would it be? I'll give you 5 seconds as I slowly give you the microphone.
Yours are great. I hope no one's counting characters. I think my message to other corporations would be, don't try to do this alone. You know, this is collaborative work. This is work that has to be done in partnership. You know, do this work in right relationship with others.
I think this is a really challenging tweet to be 5 seconds to come up with something. I think for me, it's really, communication and collaboration is key. Like I said, we're moving away from a voluntary system succeeding. We're now moving towards something that I think is going to become mandatory. Once something becomes mandatory, communication and collaboration is key. If you really want to have an impact, make sure you're sharing that message, make sure that you have partners in the process, and make sure you're open to those challenges, because communication is key, collaboration is key to overcoming all of those barriers.
We're gonna close now. I just want to say that I've been feeling a lot of, like probably many of you, I'm always in between kind of outrage and optimism, and kind of pivoting between the two. And I've been feeling a lot of outrage lately, to be honest. What's happening around the world on climate, on food, on COVID, on debt. There's a lot of suffering. And I do still see the kind of legacy of colonialism playing out in these crises. But then every now and then, you come to a space where you feel some optimism about a new way forward. And this morning was that for me. So join me, a really warm round of applause for Kate and Mandy.